All right, I'm back this time with an example of how I wet set my hand-spun wool yarn. Here's a freshly spun skein of merino. I've tied it off in an additional place with some ribbon so it's all ready for its bath. This little guy on the right is an example of a yarn made up of two plies from completely different spins. Leftovers from the main skein here, plus a gray singles that I spun quite a while ago, so it's well rested compared to the freshly spun ply. Because of this imbalance, there is quite a bit of extra twist, but let's give it a good soak and see what it looks like once dry. I'm filling my little studio sink with hot tap water and adding a bit of soap similar to Synthrapol. You could also use Blue Dawn dish soap. The best way to set your handspun yarn is to soak it. In some instances, I steam set my handspun, but for best results, it is advisable to wet set it. Wool has memory. It wants to return to its natural state, so soaking yarn is ideal for waking that memory back up and having a nice balanced twist. I also think it's a good practice to soak handspun as it removes any dirt or oils from your hands from spinning. I will soak the yarn for approximately 20 to 30 minutes and then check to see if any of the dye runs. It shouldn't, as I dyed the merino roving myself, and I usually make sure the dye is completely exhausted, but sometimes some residual dye may not get completely removed. I normally dye in a crock pot, so I know when the water is clear there shouldn't be any residual coming out in the rinse, but some colors are harder to exhaust than others. I've decided to soak both skeins at the same time, so I've tied them together to keep them from tangling. I gently press the yarn into the water until submerged. I'll come back in about 20 minutes or so to check for any dye runoff. If it's clear, we will proceed with the next step. Okay, I'm back, and after a quick check, the water is clear, so no more soaks are necessary. After draining the water, I rinse the yarn with some hot tap water. I try to keep the water temp consistent. Felting happens with a change in temperature and agitation. I'm giving it a gentle squeeze to remove some of the water, careful not to wring it or tug or pull, not just for felting, but I don't want to do anything that would stretch out the yarn or misshapen it. By the way, if you are nervous about felting, you can spin superwash wool. The only time I temperature shock my handspun is if I want to full it, a process I will have to show in another video with a textured art yarn. I also don't weight my yarn during the drying process. It can break the fibers and only gives the illusion of a balanced yarn. It's important to learn how to spin a balanced yarn, and that can only be achieved with practice, practice, practice. All right, another squeeze pressing up against the side of the sink to remove some water, and then I'll take it outside for a good thwacking. Most people will whack their handspun for texture purposes, to open up the fibers and give them more strength. But I find this process also helps align the plies and the fibers, which is especially important in the case of a handspun yarn that is slightly overspun or unbalanced. I filmed this in the winter time, but as you can see, it doesn't stop me from giving it a good crack on the side of the house. I turn the skein 3 or 4 times so that different parts get a good snap. It's incredibly satisfying and a great way to release any pent-up frustrations. The gentler version of thwacking is to give the yarn a good snap between your hands. But let's face it, that's less satisfying than a good crack on a hard surface. As it's winter, I will hang this yarn indoors to dry. I prefer to dry my yarn with good airflow and a heat source. Showers and tubs are popular spots, but my bathroom doesn't have enough airflow, so the yarn takes forever to dry. I hang it on the end of this clothing rack I use for arranging yarn I'm working on in my studio. A heat pump nearby circulates hot air, aiding in the drying process. I place a towel under it to catch drips. As you can see, the yarn is quite straight now, but it's weighted down with water. We'll have to wait and see once it's dry if I actually achieved balance. A few minutes later, I returned with a shop towel to squeeze out some water as gravity pulled it to the bottom of the skein. This helps the yarn dry faster, prevents the towel on the floor from getting too wet, and speeds up the drying process. I'll leave this to dry overnight and come back tomorrow and see how it looks. Here I am back the next day. It's no surprise that the main skein is hanging nice and straight since it was fairly balanced to begin with. As you can see, the mini skein has a slight twist, but it is significantly better than before setting. This slight twist won't be noticeable or barely noticeable in a knitting project. Let's take a closer look at the final product. First, the full skein, 450 yards of sport weight yarn that I hand dyed and hand spun. I love the vibrant colors. It's very soft and squishy, a typical inviting skein of hand spun yarn. The smaller mini skein is 80 yards of sport weight. I love the contrast between the gray ply and the colorful ply. This is a great technique if you want to maximize a braid of dyed fiber. Thanks so much for checking out my video on how to wet set the twist for this hand spun yarn. I'll be back with more examples from my studio soon. Until next time.